Hi, welcome back. This is part 2 of the brief timeline of the secular study of religion in the United States, which I'm also using to talk about the history of Christianity in America, a brief overview. So last time we were talking about the founding of Princeton by the New Light Presbyterians. I want to pick up with the influence of Europe on thinking in these new universities. And it starts with what's called naturalism. Naturalism is an alternative worldview that says all that exists is nature. Matter is ultimate reality. There is no spirit, there is no God, there is no soul, there's no afterlife. This is a new view that's a challenge, an external challenge to Christianity. And it comes together through philosophers such as Charles Darwin giving an alternative explanation of the origin of man through a natural progress of evolution, through Karl Marx giving an alternative interpretation of the development of history through economic struggle, through Sigmund Freud giving an alternative view of the human personality where he talks about the id, the ego, and the superego instead of the soul. He also has an alternative version of religion and of things like the human problem and self-deception. And we have later in our timeline Friedrich Nietzsche, who is going to say God is dead. All of these figures, Marx, Freud, Darwin, Nietzsche, provide the philosophical underpinnings for an alternative interpretation of reality. It challenges Christianity. It's an external challenge, and it influences what's called historical criticism, which is a naturalistic way of interpreting the scriptures, and it assumes that the scriptures are not inspired and given by God, but are rather written by humans in a historic circumstance for particular historical reasons. Historical criticism undermines theology in Christianity. It is a challenge to Christianity that is first external but becomes internal. It causes a division within Christianity between liberals and conservatives. And this is going to go on to our present day. Historical criticism is a way of interpreting scripture that doesn't take for granted the existence of God and the divinity of Christ. So you can see how that would be a challenge to Orthodox Christianity. So there's a crisis now with liberal Christianity. Liberal Christianity still wants to have Christianity as a social function, but questions some of the truth value of the claims of Christianity. 1751, we have the founding of the University of Pennsylvania by Benjamin Franklin. The curriculum is still religious, but the school itself is much more practical in purpose. So this is where we're going to see it shift in the emphasis in the university from theological training and particularly classical education to something more practical, focusing on vocation, getting a job, if you want to think of it that way. All right, by 1776, we have the Declaration of Independence and the United States of America. So notice, we have a lot of history before we even get to be the United States. 1791, we have the First Amendment being added to the United States Constitution. It prohibits the making of any law respecting an establishment of religion or impeding the free exercise of religion. The Protestants in the New World were vying for dominance, and this law particularly was applied to the Protestants, that the United States will not be any one brand of Protestant religion so that the others are persecuted. But then it begins to become expanded and expanded to include the plurality of religions in the United States. At this point, the plurality is just mostly Protestants, divisions, Reformed, Baptist, Lutheran, Church of England. And so we're going to have an influx of Catholics and Jewish people that this amendment applies to, and then all the religions it will apply to eventually. But notice there's two parts to this, and sometimes they're in tension. There's a whole history of the First Amendment you can study. Respecting the establishment of religion, so the state cannot establish any religion, and the state cannot hinder the exercise of religion. And so these two clauses of the First Amendment are still being worked out. In the application of them is still being worked out in the United States today, even this summer. Okay, in Germany, or what is now Germany, 1794, Immanuel Kant is a philosopher who is trying to answer the skepticism of David Hume. He was raised Lutheran, Kant, and incidentally, David Hume was raised Scottish Presbyterian. His dad was a pastor, and he rejected it. Immanuel Kant raised Lutheran, and it's a particularly pietistic version of Lutheranism, focusing on your own virtues and your own relationship with Christ. That comes out of a certain strain of Lutheranism that isn't particularly concerned with the world, but Kant is concerned with the world. He's also concerned with the skepticism of David Hume and wants to find a way out of the skepticism. He proposes perhaps there can be a combination between empiricism that says all of our knowledge is through the senses, and rationalism, which has some room for ideas that aren't influenced by the senses. A priori is what they're called. Now, Kant did something to try to bridge these two ways of knowing that causes further skepticism. He said, all of our knowledge here is through the senses, but there must be another reality beyond the senses. He has to posit that. So he can't prove it through the senses. So all of our knowledge in this world, what he calls the phenomenal world, is through our senses. But we need God, we need the soul for things like morality and justice and an afterlife. So he posits there's this other realm. He calls it the noumenal realm, and it's beyond the senses. And so it's almost as if you have to have faith in that realm. And he thought he was protecting religion from criticism by introducing his theory of the distinction between the noumenal realm and the phenomenal realm. But this just leads to further skepticism and fideism. So he doesn't really fix the problem. He also has critiques of the traditional proofs for the existence of God. But in this writing, The Conflict of the Faculties, he provides a new model for education. And this is going to influence the United States in a very significant way. And in this model, he's going to say, let's make a division between religious school, theology, and all that goes with that, and secular school, where we study secular topics. So there's a division in the faculty between religious school and secular school, or seminary and secular university. And in this university, there are different faculties. It's going to abandon the classical model. The classical model is where you study the trivium, dialectic, the grammar, the dialectic, the rhetorical, and within those you study philosophy, literature, history, the humanities, and the arts. There were other schools for medicine and graduate school for theology. But the German model is going to change that. The German model is going to allow for things like, hey, let's study sociology and anthropology and history and sociology on their own terms without the religious stuff. So they're going to be secular study of these different areas. Okay, and then in 1819 is the founding of the University of Virginia, which is the first non-religious state university in the United States, and it takes on the German model. So what was happening was, in the United States, these colleges that started and were religious only went to the BA, bachelor's level. So if you wanted to get a PhD, you had to go to Europe, particularly Germany, because they had the best colleges at the time, to get your PhD. So pastors were going to Germany, getting their PhD, learning the skeptical ideas of Germany and the biblical criticism, and coming back and teaching those things. So this also causes some disruption in the Christian communities in the United States. It also convinces people that we need to start our own graduate schools. Instead of sending them to Europe, let's start our own. And that's where these state-run universities begin. I mentioned Karl Marx earlier, but here are his official dates. He is going to give a naturalistic economic explanation of religion. He's going to say religion is the opiate of the masses. It is what keeps people pacified. The proletariat, which are the oppressed classes, need religion to get through life. It's sort of like a hope for the afterlife that helps them through this life. That's why it's like a drug. And the bourgeoisie are the upper class people, the factory owners who have it in their best interest to keep these people pacified, so they perpetuate religion and the religious myth to keep people oppressed. That's Marx's theory. Now, when we get into 1880s to 1900s, we begin to get the formal study of religion apart from theology. So Max Muller is the first professor of comparative philology at Oxford University in England. He is the founder of Indian Studies and Comparative Religion. And by Indian, it's Indian, not Native Americans, but he studies religion in India. He learns Sanskrit and translates the Hindu scriptures and introduces Hindu teaching to the West. And these scholars who are turned off by Christianity become fascinated with Hinduism. This brings Hinduism to England first and then to the United States. I'll tell you more about that in a moment when we get to this Parliament of Religion. So this is the beginning of the study of religion as an academic discipline. In 1859, we have the publication of Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species. I mentioned Darwin earlier, that he's giving an alternative origins story to the Christian account. In 1893, we have the first Parliament of Religion in Chicago. This is a huge event, a fair. It goes with the World's Fair, the first World's Fair. And the Parliament of Religions is where all of the religions from around the world are invited to give talks about their religion, except the Latter-day Saints, Mormons, were not invited. And really the Hindus weren't invited, but somebody brought a Hindu Swami. His name was Swami Vivekananda. And Vivekananda was given an opportunity to speak, and he spoke about the beauty of Hinduism and how Hinduism was all-encompassing and there's a home for all religions within Hinduism. This is interesting because Hinduism believes all is one, so of course all the religions would be the same, all is one, but it's fascinating to people who want something other than Christianity. They're turned off by Christianity, so Hinduism gets an interest here in the United States at this time. Scholars want to study it. A little bit later, by 1900, Friedrich Nietzsche passes away. He's the philosopher that says God is dead. Now, what he means is that God is no longer relevant for culture, for society, for people. Maybe individually, maybe you like it that there's a God, but he's no longer culturally relevant. And by this time, Nietzsche is seeing ahead. He may have been right, but the people of his day didn't quite understand yet. Nietzsche says, I see these new philosophers of the future, and they are going to usher in a new era. And I think he was right. I think these new philosophers of the future were the postmodern philosophers. I talk about this in some of my lectures on my YouTube channel. But in a nutshell, some of these philosophers are going to tear down the old values that are Christian, that are connected to classical philosophy, and they're going to push out new values, particularly this will to power. And the will to power is the idea that everything in nature is in motion and in flux, and human beings need to give order to this flux, and we do that by asserting our will on nature and on other human beings. So there's a clash of wills. I'm going to make the case, I'm working on this now, that Friedrich Nietzsche's ideas, particularly his ideas of how we know things, he calls it perspectivalism, which is your perspective, underlies all of the philosophy after his day, up to this very moment. So perspectivalism becomes a dominant view, not right away, but 50 years or so later. And now we have to listen to each other's stories. We have this thing called standpoint epistemology, where the person who has had these certain experiences in their life, perhaps connected to their gender or their race, they know more than the rest of us because they have had the experience. They have the perspective that the others don't. So they have a knowledge of it based on their experience. That comes from Nietzsche's perspectivalism. So say I. Okay. I talked about Freud. He has a naturalistic psychological explanation of religion. Then, in the United States, in the universities are growing. We're getting more universities at this time. There's a high demand for education. It's in the German model. And between the years of 1870 to 1930, there's something that's called the secular revolution in the American university. Now, there's a book I'm going to show you in the footnotes of this handout that you can read more about that secular revolution. It's fascinating. The book talks about how there's this division among the faculty between the theology people and the secular people in the same university, and how people with a secular interest start to take over positions of power and influence the university away from religion and towards secularism, where secularism is just the absence of religion, this world only. Sometimes it is naturalism and pushes naturalism. But this becomes the model of the university that we have today. So there's no religion involved when you study journalism or sociology, anthropology, religious studies. We don't really talk about God in school as if there was a God. That happened in this time span. The move away from the schools being established by religion and teaching religion to the schools being taught through a secular perspective and run by secular people. That's an interesting piece in history, and how that happened is outlined in this book called The Secular Revolution. Now, this is an important movement in the United States. The Niagara Bible Conference and the beginning of fundamentalism. Fundamentalism is a reaction to liberalism in the church in the United States. So I talked about the rise of naturalism and biblical criticism leading to a liberal interpretation of Christianity. The God is Dead movement is going to be part of that. And fundamentalism is a reaction. Fundamentalism is where a group of Christians, it starts with intellectuals, decide that these certain tenets are the fundamentals of Christianity, and if you don't hold to these tenets, then you're not considered orthodox. I believe I mentioned those 5 fundamentals in a previous video. I don't have my notes with me right now, so I don't recall them right off the top of my head, but it has to do with the virgin birth of Christ, the incarnation, that he is literally God incarnate, that he died, he rose from the dead, and is seated at the right hand of God. There are some others. I know there's 5, but I'll let you, maybe if I click on this, we can find it. I know I mentioned it in another, no, this is just going to give us way more than we want. Yeah, there's a lot of history here that you can read. This is particularly important, the Princeton theology component. Princeton, remember, was started by the Puritans. Princeton Theological Seminary was the theology component of that school. It's still there, Princeton Theological Seminary, but it's become a lot more liberal. But the Princeton theologians were involved in crafting a counter-argument to what was coming from Europe in this naturalism and biblical historicism. So fundamentalism tended to be a literal interpretation of Scripture, literalism, and that's going to lead to a lot of problems for Christianity. I thought I could finish this handout in 2 videos, but it looks like I'm going to have to make a 3rd. So I'm going to pause here, and we'll pick up again in another video.